Hello, welcome back to hour 2 of Bedtime with Bruce. I'm Bruce, and as those of you that have been following the show know, the second hour of the night is dedicated to erotic literature. And we are reading The Secret of Blackoaks by Ashley Carter. It is a seamy, steamy, sexy, pre-Civil War, set in the Deep South, sexy novel. It's got a little bit of everything. Got a little man on man, got some black on white, got some white on white, got some chick on chick. I don't know, I'm guessing about that. It hasn't happened yet, but we're hoping. The last installment of this wasn't really sexy at all, and I'm sorry about that, but we got to read the book as it's written. I have looked ahead in tonight's reading. I can assure you there's some action coming up, so that's kind of cool. So stick with me. I promise we'll get you there. As I said in the first hour, we got some information from some of our viewers that there have been some technical difficulties. You know, it's been a choppy video. We believe that we have addressed that issue and fixed it. So if you're still not seeing it, you know, in a smooth format, let us know, please. You can contact us with comments, questions at bedtimewithbruce@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you, even if it's just to tell us hello. We like to see that you're listening. I said this in the first hour. Our little map on our website, we have a map, and dots get put on the cities and towns when people log in to check us out. And we are in about 15 different countries now on the third night. So that's cool. People in the Philippines are enjoying us. Germany, Ireland, England, France, Austria, Australia, Mexico, Canada, Belgium, someone from Tel Aviv. I thought that was pretty cool. So thank you all for joining me, and thanks for watching, and we appreciate the support. And as long as you're watching, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. So without further ado, let's jump into The Secret of Blackoaks. Oh, I'm sorry. When we left off, Styles Kenrick, the master of Blackoaks, was explaining to Mr. Dennison, Mr. Cletus Dennison, that he was planning on turning Blackoaks into a slave breeding ground, like a stud farm, to create Fulani slaves. Fulani is some sort of tribe, and they made the best slaves, apparently. So he wants to take his Fulani slaves and breed them and sell them. So that's where we're at. Styles laughed with a self-mocking bitterness. He and his deceased father-in-law had had little in common, but if they shared that same irresistible dream, even when it was almost impossible of accomplishment. Well, he had contracted the disease, or mental illness, or whatever it was that had driven Baynard to the moment of his death, and that now possessed him. He had boasted to those hidebound planters, clinging by their fingernails to the status quo of the cotton economy on land no longer able to support it. He had boasted that he would market fancy blacks from his plantation. He'd make that boast a reality if he could first steal a little time. He stared at that stack of debris. He stared at that stack of debts, current and past due. He thought about the impending arrival of the good brother Alexander, and there was the charming, cordial letter from Mr. Cletus Dennison, the gentleman slave breeder. Styles took up the letter almost reluctantly and scanned it, feeling the illness spread in the crannies of his empty belly. I shall be in the vicinity of your incredibly lovely residence a few days after the Christmas season. I hope I shall be welcome for a brief sojourn in the company of your esteemed family at Blackoaks Plantation. I have much to discuss with you, Styles, and look forward to seeing you again. Styles dropped Dennison's letter back to the desktop. Not a word in it about the Fulanis. Styles' hands shook. It was there between every stilted and Spencerian penned line of it. 12,000, 15,000 for each Fulani boy. Name your own price. Dennison would be here, smiling, unyielding, unanswerable in his logic, immovable in his avowed intention to own the Fulanis a few days after the Christmas season. Styles stared helplessly at those overdue bills. Time rushed forward like a locomotive out of control on a steep downgrade. How could he resist Dennison's offers? Sale of the 2 black Fulani boys would buy him at least a temporary solvency, remove all threat from Farrell's probing, and end forever the dream that had sustained old man Baynard and now possessed Styles Kenrick, mind and soul. The timorous knocking at the corridor door was repeated a 3rd time before Styles became aware of it. The Estes came into the office, diffidently, limping on calloused, aching feet. "A visiting white gentleman to see you, Master Styles." From a habit that had been germinating in these recent months, as master of Blackoaks, Styles winced under a quick stab of anxiety. Bill collector, deputy from the sheriff, Mr. Cletus Dennison arriving ahead of time. "All right, the Estes, send him in." The Estes squirmed uncomfortably and spoke to the pattern woven into the carpeting. "A trashy white gentleman, Master Styles, sir. I told him he should wait out at the head of the lane and I'd send him away." "I'd have sent him away, massa, but that white man cussed me pretty good, he did, and insisted on seeing you." Styles nodded. He shrugged his jacket up on his slender shoulders, straightened his tie, arranged his cuffs. He took one long draught of whiskey, and then walked out of the house, running his hands smoothingly along the side of his dark hair. The Estes' estimation of his visitor set Styles' own attitude and manner towards the man. He was cordial but aloof, gracious but remote. He smiled at the stranger, but tilted his head and smiled along his patrician nose. The guest wore expensive custom-tailored clothes that were travel must, wrinkled, sweated. His broad-brimmed hat had cost dearly, but was now battered, stained. The man's beard was 3 days, ragged. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s. He slouched on the front seat of an aging coach, the rear of which had been converted into a carryall, with plank benches along each side. As Styles approached, he saw spancels and shackles screwed under the carriage sideboards. The man was a traveling slave trader, as low on the social ladder as one could get. A faintly haughty and swaggering manner about the stranger angered Styles at sight. The man waited until Styles was almost to the carriage before he swung down to meet him, a petty retaliation for having been forced to await him 50 yards from the manor's house. His boots were run over and hadn't felt polish in a raccoon's age. "Howdy, sir. I'm a slave buyer. Name of Culverhouse, sir. Darwin Culverhouse, from up the Piedmont country." "Why did you wish to see me?" Styles did not extend his hand, nor did his guest. They regarded each other smilingly but waringly. "Why, I just told you, sir. I'm a slave buyer. You got slaves?" He winked. "I'm a slave buyer, but with a few different wrinkles, sir. I'm from the Culverhouse family, son of old Marshal Custis Culverhouse, and my mother was a Darwin, a fine old Piedmont family. We've been Piedmont people since colonial days. My pappy went into slave breeding, and when I grew up, trained in that art, I was restless. I decided what I wanted to do was travel and trade slaves. But where a man needed to sell for one reason or another, buy where a man needed to sell for one reason or another. And being from a great old plantation and a most respectable family, I have a real insight into the problems faced by us landowner planter families. We can always use ready cash, eh?" Insulted, Styles said, "I don't believe I have any stock for sale, Mr. Culverhouse, and obviously you don't have any animals to offer me." Culverhouse laughed. "Ain't selling this trip, sir. Buying. Price of slaves is inflating. If a man's got the right stock for the market. Now I'm here to do you a real favor. I'm here to relieve you of any quality you got to offer. My plan works like this, sir. If I buy inferior stock down here, I can trade it for better grade down the road. I indeed work a special favor for you planters. I take what you don't want, and I provide you hard, ready cash in gold for your stock." Styles fixed Culverhouse with an insolent smile, but his own heartbeats quickened. Was this a good omen? He needed ready cash badly. Ready cash could buy him a little time. He'd never let this slave trader suspect, but felt his luck was changing. He'd pick up whatever ready money Culverhouse offered, and he'd find some way to forestall his creditors, withstand Mr. Cletus Dennison's incredible offers for his prized stock, and keep Brother Alexander at bay. These thoughts flashed across his mind as Culverhouse was speaking, but the trader assumed Styles' silence was resistance, and he smiled persuasively. Listen, sir, many gentlemen planters like yourself hesitate to sell their stock to these itinerant slave peddlers that run their animals beside their horse or shackle them in shameful coffles. I certify to you, sir, you sell me a slave, it rides back in the back of my carriage. I figure these blacks are nigh human, and these hard days, a lot of them get human blood in them. They need care to keep them healthy and sellable. No plodding along in the mud and rain and inclement weather to get them sick and run down. They ride in my carriage. If they be docile animals, I don't use shackle or spancel. I treat them as humane as an animal can be treated, as I'm sure you do, sir. Finally, Styles nodded. I am Mr. Styles Kenrick, he said. I may have a few slaves I can spare you. What number do you have in mind? Culverhouse laughed genially. Like to view your stock before I make that decision, sir. Let's say I won't waste your time, and I'll take what the traffic will bear. You got culls? I may not wish to encumber myself with too many. On the other hand, you got a few sturdy animals. I might make a most rewarding deal. I take your culls off your hand at a price for the opportunity to avail myself of your best quality stock. They climbed into Culverhouse's carriage. Permeating the smells of horse sweat and ammonia was the strong musk of black bodies. Styles said, I'm interested in improving bloodlines among my stock. We may not be able to agree on what I'd be willing to part with and you to buy. Let's not fret the details, sir. Culverhouse glanced admiringly towards the Fieldstone mansion as they drove past towards the work area in the valley and the slaves' quarters on the incline below. Beautiful chalet, sir. Lovely. Sometimes, seeing a really fine old manor house like this, I find myself getting homesick for the most gracious life at Windward Hills, up in the Piedmont. Windward Hills, Culverhouse, family estate. Yes, sir, despite all, a man gets homesick. As the carriage approached the barn, Styles saw that the blacks who had congregated at the arrival of a visitor were suddenly nowhere in sight. A few dogs sprawled in the sunset between the slave huts. The older slaves had disappeared inside the cabins. Even the children had been removed from the roadway. Niggers are funny animals, Culverhouse observed. They can tell better than a human when something is amiss. They came a-running when word spread a visitor had arrived, but now you don't own a nigger in your farthest field. I vow, you don't know you're dickering with a slave trader. I'm sorry, let me read that again. They came a-running when word spread a visitor had arrived, but now you don't own a nigger in your farthest field. I vow that don't know you're dickering with a slave trader. Styles called Blade out of the commissary. When Culverhouse saw the young Fulani Blade, he whistled between his teeth. My God, a Puritan gala. Fulani. Styles' pride vibrated in his voice. Is it for sale? Styles shook his head, wanting to laugh. Culverhouse was a dreamer too. Styles told Blade to bring several of the families of slaves into the third slave shack on the incline. The Fulani trotted ahead of the carriage. Shouldn't have let me see the Fulani, Culverhouse said. No right where I could dispose of an animal like that for a fortune, a real retirement fortune. And no ordinary black is going to look like much to me, and culls will seem downright sickening. Styles motioned the trader to pull the carriage in before the cabin where Perseus lived with his wife, Pooty, and their offspring. Styles swung down and went up the steps. He called, Pooty, would you come out here, please? Taut, brittle silence settled in the cabin, as if people inside were crouched, holding their breath. By the time the black woman, Pooty, came to the door, Blade was walking with several other families down the incline. The slaves stood in the sun, squinting, mutely watching Styles and the slave buyer. Culverhouse gave Pooty a cursory inspection. This here wench has a bad hair lip, he said. I told you the stock I have to offer you is blemished, with traits I don't want passed on. She has 4 colts. They range in age up to 10. You can have all of them when you take Pooty. As you can see, the wench is pregnant. Well, that at least is in her favor, Culverhouse said. I'll look her over. If she's got no other disfigurements, nothing that will interfere with her working, I might go up to $900 for her and her litter. Culverhouse stepped closer to Pooty, who was openly crying now. Culverhouse spoke in a kindly but coldly firm tone. Shut up now. I ain't going to hurt you none. Your name is Pooty, eh? She nodded, sniffling. She saw her man, Perseus, running up the incline, and she reached out towards him. But Culverhouse's voice chilled. Stand still, Pooty. Don't want to have to tell you that again. The woman subsided, shivering as she stared down towards Perseus. He stood, round-shouldered, impotent at the end of the narrow stoop. Culverhouse unbuttoned the front of Pooty's dress and with both hands hefted, punched, kneaded, and mashed her breast. She winced but did not protest aloud. Seems sound enough. Likely 22 plantings old, Culverhouse spoke over his shoulder to Styles. He knelt, then ran his hands over Pooty's bare feet, along her calves, upper thighs, and under her skirt. Turn around, he told her, and bend over. Brace yourself on that chair back. What you gonna do, master? You got piles, I don't want you. When Pooty was bent forward, her arms braced against the back of the used-slick kitchen chair, Culverhouse pushed her skirt over her hips, baring her buttocks. She trembled violently, but when she tried to move away from his probing hands, he spoke coldly. Damn it, nigger, stand still unless you crave the back of my hand across your ugly hair-lipped face. He spread the cheeks of her buttocks and probed into her anus with his third finger. At last satisfied, he jerked her dress down and, wiping his hands on his trousers, turned to face Styles. He shrugged. Except for her hair lip, she's sound enough. Got that little protrusion in her asshole like most women get childbearing. $900 for her and her litter? That's a good price, sir. I got to get at a costly increment on her just to break even. An ugly wench is not the easiest merchandise to get shed of. Styles nodded and Culverhouse asked if he had more stock to offer. Styles glanced towards Blade. Is Peleg's woman, Franny, here? A young black woman, her hair in tightly pinned cornrows across her skull, came out of the crowd, gripping the head of the man with all her strength. Gripping the hand of the man. She looked ready to vomit. The buck for sale with her? Culverhouse asked. When Styles said Peleg was not for sale at this time, Culverhouse shrugged. Tell him to stay off this porch. Styles inclined his head, gesturing Peleg to remain on the ground while Franny went slowly up the steps. She might have been on her way to the guillotine. Culverhouse smiled. Why, this here is a right comely wench. What are you parting her with for? She carrying some disease? She has 2 saplings that go along with her, Styles was casual, non-committal. By now, Culverhouse had opened the front of Franny's frock and thrust his hands in to probe her breast. Hell, he said over his shoulder, so that's her flaw, huh? One tit a lot bigger than all the other. One of this wench's titties hardly developed at all. Styles merely waited silently until Culverhouse completed his examination of her teeth for sign of decay and her anus for piles. The trader shrugged and then said, I'll pony up $1,600 for the lot, both wenches and their drops. $1,700, Styles said. He brought forward 3 young boys. One was badly retarded, another victim of childhood rickets. The third was apparently healthy. Culverhouse could discover no obvious blemish on the youth. He laughed worriedly, but said quite seriously, I find nothing wrong with this one, but I ain't no way convinced, sir. Dealing with you, Mr. Styles, has been a real education for a long-time slave buyer. Mr. Kendrick, Styles said. Mr. Styles Kendrick. Oh, I'll long remember that name, sir, Culverhouse laughed, did some mental arithmetic, and said, if you'll take $4,000 for the whole pack, I'll overlook that. I don't know what in the hell ails this sound-looking animal, and take my chances. Styles attempted to remain casual when he accepted Culverhouse's offer. The slave trader laughed, self-deprecatingly, paid him in gold from the thick chest built in beneath the seat of the carriage, even providing leather pouches for transporting the cash. I got a notion that tells me I'm out of my depth, sir, and this just ain't my day. Styles thanked him and turned away without inviting the trader into the house for a drink or a meal. He walked through the silent ring of slaves. His heart leapt. He felt exultant. This was his day. He had done openly what old Baynard accomplished in stealth. He had sold enough slaves to buy himself brief respite from ruin. And in his mind was congealing a decision that had been germinating for weeks. He would take another bold step from which Baynard had always flinched. He was considering a daring plan that might save him, something old Baynard had never had the guts to attempt, even at his most desperate. Why not borrow money, right here, from the bank in Mount Zion? What the hell did he care what Somerton Tetherow or any of the other planners might learn of his financial condition? He could buy time, and he could save the loans possible to him from Blandford Ware's bank in Tallahassee for the purchase of Fulani wenches. He could make it all work. He could defeat all his enemies, including time. He could tell Mr. Cletus Dennison to go to hell with his excessive offers for Blade and Moab. He was smiling by the time he reached the villa on the plateau across the valley from the slave quarters. He could tell that Darwin Culverhouse was experiencing difficulty in loading his purchased stock into his carriage. From the driveway there rose the sound of hysterical sobbing. Stiles did not glance back. At last Culverhouse had the 3 boys, the 2 women, and their brood shackled on the benches in the rear of the carriage. He climbed aboard and took up the thick-stalked buggy whip, as much of a weapon of defense as an instrument to move his horses through the silent, unmoving herds of slaves. He moved the carriage down the incline. Behind him, Pootie's man Perseus had sunk to the ground at the edge of his stoop, his arms clutching at the support. He was crying openly like a child. He did not watch the carriage move down the incline, cross the workyards in the big valley, and go up the rocky roadway past the big house. He struck his head against a thick post and wept. After a long time he hit his head again, harder than before. Franny's man had not moved from the foot of the steps before the cabin. Peleg stared at the wagon, watching it down the lane between the 2 great trees and the formidable fieldstone gateway and the east-west trace beyond. But then he turned his head, his eyes dry and stricken. After a moment he fixed his gaze on the young wench who stood on the stoop, immediately next to Perseus's cabin. She wore a much-washed cotton dress. It was too small for her. Her breast protruded in extraordinary firmness and fullness over her round little belly. When she saw that Peleg was staring back at her, she put her shoulders back, thrusting her voluptuous breast forward, straining against the faded fabric. Her hardening nipples were clearly outlined under the cloth. She smiled at Peleg. He did not return her smile, but he went on staring at her breast, and he did not look again towards the departing carriage. Okay. That was an ugly scene. Definitely not sexy, but I think it's about to get better. Miss Jamie Lee Seton sat the gray horse easily, gracefully, handling the animal with practiced expertise. "Well, I've been riding horses since I was 3 years old," she told Moab, who rode respectfully just behind her. "Had my own pony when I was 5. "Why don't we ride along the trace?" Moab suggested when they came away from the horse barns. "We'll ride where I want to," Jamie Lee told him. "Cousin Stiles says it's particularly lovely along the creek, and he said you know every inch of that woodland." Moab exhaled and said nothing more. They skirted the slave quarters, towards which Jamie Lee did not even glance. Ascending a knoll, they approached a fieldstone house, well cared for in a carefully tended yard. As they cantered past the house, Moab led his horse slow to a walk. He gazed towards the house in passing, for the moment lost in reverie, overwhelmed with stirring and pleasant memory. Those nights when he had lain awake, awaiting the departure before dawn of the overseer Pilzer, the way he had waited in that tack room, breathless and empty-bellied with longing. In his mind he clearly saw the image of himself bared to the waist, running across the yard, gliding like a shadow through the window, and running across the room to her bed. Jamie Lee, well ahead of him, jerked the reins, stopping her horse. Her voice lashed back at him, shattering his thoughts. "Come on, nigger boy, what are you dallying around here?" Moab did not reply, but sank his heels into the flanks of his tan horse, hurrying it. At that moment, a woman ran out of the front door of the Fieldstone cottage. The screen door whined and slapped shut behind her like a brief, sharp clap of thunder. She was running as she came through the doorway, but she slowed as she reached the shadowed perch. She stopped and stood rigidly in the shadow of the overhang, staring after Moab and Miss Jamie Lee. Attracted by the slamming of the front door, Jamie Lee twisted in the saddle and peered at the woman poised on the shadowed porch. As nearly as Jamie Lee could see, the woman appeared to be in her late 20s, old, yet still pretty in a tired and faded way. She said in a mocking tone, "Who's that, Moab?" "Miss Florine," he said. "Miss Florine Pilzer." "Do you know the old lady?" "She ain't old," Moab answered, sullenly, and then added quickly and humbly, "Ma'am." "Miss Florine is a very tolerable lady." "You must know her pretty well," Jamie Lee persisted in a tone calculated to torment him. "She certainly seems to know you." Moab exhaled heavily. "I lived up here on this place once. Miss Florine and her husband, the overseer, Master Pilzer. They were kind to me." "I bet she was." Moab did not reply. Jamie Lee laughed at him in a taunting and cutting way. They rode downslope into a hummock of pines where the loudest sound was the cry of yellow hammers. "Do you really know this creek well?" she inquired. "Every inch of it. I've played along here long as I can remember." "Then you must know the best place to be alone." "Ma'am?" She laughed across her shoulder at him. "Ma'am?" she mocked him. "I said, if you had a black wench and you wanted to pester her, only you wanted to be sure that no one would find you, where would you take her on this creek?" He did not reply, and she cursed him. "Damn you, I ask you a question. Do you know a hidden place where no one could find you?" "Yes, ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee, ma'am. It's down the creek a ways." "Show me the way there." "It's kind of hard riding, Miss Jamie Lee." "I can ride a horse better than you can. Don't worry about me. I told you, take me there." Moab nodded. He urged his mount forward, going past Jamie Lee on the narrow trail. It was rough. The creek leaped across rocks, twisted, suddenly back on itself like a broken snake. It spread out and oozed through swampy places. Yellowhammers and blue jays screamed at them. Small animals skittered in the underbrush. Moab did not speak, and Jamie Lee watched him with a set, chilled smile. Jamie Lee said, "Do you know what I thought was the most beautiful thing I saw when I first got here to Blackoaks?" "No, ma'am." "You." He did not speak. She said, "Aren't we nearly there?" "I'm certainly lost. I bet you are." "We can go back if you wish, ma'am." "I didn't say anything about going back. When can we stop?" "You know goddamn good and well nobody could find us here." "No, ma'am. We've crossed the creek 3 or 4 times. We've ridden on rocky ground where we didn't leave no track." "The hell with that. When can we stop?" He drew up. "We can stop here, right now, Miss Jamie Lee, ma'am, if you want to." "I want to." She drew rein and then sat in her saddle, watching him. "Hell, don't just sit there like a bump on a log. Help me down." He swung out of his saddle, tied their mounts, then he reached up to take her arms. But Jamie Lee laughed and hurled herself out upon him. Her horse whinnied and reared up. Moab caught her and almost fell. He managed to brace himself against a pine, steadied himself, holding her. He tried to set her on her feet, but she twisted around, pressing her fevered thighs against him, her innominate bone cutting into him like small daggers. He tried to disengage himself, but she dug her nails savagely into his biceps. "Stop being a damn fool. You know why I brought you here." "No, ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee. Don't give me all that humble darky talk." "What you mean, ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee? Stop it. You know damn well what I mean. That ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee hogwash. You know why we're here. You also know about me. I know that Negro Soapy's been talking to you about me." Moab smiled tautly but said nothing. Her voice lashed at him. "Well, hasn't he? What'd Soapy say about me?" "Soapy say you had him sent into your bedroom to repair a broken hasp on one of your trunks." "And what else?" Moab exhaled. "He say the hasp wasn't broken." "Oh, did he? The damn loudmouth Negro. What else did he say?" "Ma'am?" "You heard me. Tell me, what else?" Moab looked as if he'd suspended breathing. "He say you're the first white woman he ever pestered." Her face went pale, livid. "Damn him. Talking about a white lady like that. I'll have him beaten. And I'll have the hide sliced right off his black ass. You too, if one word goes to anybody." Now he breathed. His voice was level. "No, ma'am, I'm not going to say nothing. I might know about no white ladies." Oh? Have you pestered a white woman? Moab smiled and shook his head. Damp beads of sweat stood on his forehead. Let's just say I done felt the whip once, ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee. I don't hanker to feel it again. No, ma'am, no way. She laughed at him. That means you've done it with a white woman. It don't mean nothing, ma'am, Miss Jamie Lee, except that I don't crave to ever be whooped again. She laughed again. Then you better make up your mind right now to do what I tell you and keep your mouth shut. I made that mind up to do that a long time ago when you first came to get me from Master Hunter's class. I made up my mind. You're a smart-talking nigger, ain't you? You ought to be smart enough to know you can get in a peck of trouble smart-talking to white folks. I don't never do that, ma'am, never. Then get your clothes off now, unless you want me to scream. Not likely they'll hear you from here, ma'am. They'll hear me when I get back. I'll swear you raped me. Moab gazed at Miss Jamie Lee, deeply troubled. She had been loosening her clothing, tossing garments behind her, all in a matter of seconds. He breathed out heavily. She had almighty big tits, all right, and she was trembling in anticipation of what she wanted him to do. It was as if she had the fever. He shuddered. He could catch that fever fooling with her, only the fever might be fatal for him. She didn't have any sense to be careful, the way Miss Florine Pilzer did. Miss Jamie Lee Seton could get a black boy's balls chopped off. We had best head back, Moab said. You shut up and listen to me. You want me to tell Cousin Styles Kendrick that you raped me? I'll tell them that, you black ape, and they'll hang you. His voice was flat. They might hang me anyhow. What's the matter with you? Don't you want to do it to a white girl? All niggers want white girls. What's the matter with you? She grabbed his shirt. You don't think I'm pretty? He answered softly, almost in a melancholy tone. You giascatus pretty, Miss Jamie Lee. Then take your cock out. I want to see it. You down here to get married to a white gentleman. Don't you talk to me like that, you nigger. It's none of your damn... Never mind. If I'm getting married 10 times. It mattered to me. They'll catch us and they'll kill me. You don't stop talking, I'll scream rape and they'll kill you anyway. He shook his head, eyes stricken. Please don't scream, Miss Jamie Lee. Her head tilted. Then you do what I tell you. Moab's wide shoulders sagged in his denim shirt. He nodded and stood immobile. She reached out and pulled his shirt hard, ripping off its button. Oh, God, Miss Jamie Lee, you're going to get me killed. Shut up. How am I going to explain I come back from a ride with you, my shirt all tore open? She caught his Osnaburg breeches and would have torn open his fly, but he retreated, shaking his head, truly afraid of her now. I'll do it, he said. No way in God's world would I explain no buttons on my pants. He glanced down both ways across the creek. He knew they were deep in Blackoaks timberlands. Few human beings ever came here. A woodpecker was noisy in a pine. A wood rodent skittered across the winter needles. Holding his breath, Moab shrugged out of his shirt. Jamie Lee laughed, licking her tongue across her lips. Oh, that's good, Moab. You even a prettier Negro boy than I thought. You hardly black at all. You real pretty. Yes'm, Moab nodded. They'd finally reached an area of agreement. With less hesitation, Moab unbuttoned his breeches and stepped out of them. Jamie Lee's violet eyes glittered. Her cheeks flushed as if she were truly fevered. Her lips drew back from her teeth. Her gaze oozed over him and her breath quickened. Come on, Moab, she said breathless. Do it to me. I'm scared, Miss Jamie Lee, and it ain't up enough to do nothing yet. She laughed. Maybe this will make him stand up. She lifted her skirt and sank down upon the grass and spread her knees, legs bent for him. She wore no drawers above her stockings. Her white thighs gleamed. He hesitated, mortally afraid of her, a willful and headstrong white girl. He faced in his mind the penalty for being caught with her, but his flesh betrayed him. She was far lovelier than any other female he had ever encountered. Even the pale mat of pubic hair above her heated thighs was different, almost blonde, and tinted with bright red highlights in the sun. Her ragged breathing caused her full breast to quaver. He felt the familiar ache, the emptiness in his belly, the quick rise of his penis as blood engorged it so abruptly and with such force that the glands pulsed bigger and brighter than a huge ripe plum. He's ready now, Jamie Lee cried. Give it to me, Moab. Oh, give it to me now, you damn nigger. Moab's mind wheeled and spun. The rest of the world was blacked out, and everything else ceased to exist except that lovely peach blossom fresh body, those legs spread wide to receive him. The rest of humanity, the laws created and administered by the inflexible white men, the scream of a yellowhammer, the sun on the water, nothing had meaning. He saw only that triangle of red-tinted hair cresting her femininity, the liquidity at her thighs, the way her hips quivered as she thrust upward impatiently towards him. But when he fell to his knees between her widely parted legs, she caught his penis in her hand, twisting it until he bit his lip to keep from yelping in agony. Her breath was hot, her voice husky but commanding. You lay down, she told him. Lay down on your back. I want to ride you, nigger. I'm going to ride you. Ride you, ride you. Moab sank back on the grass, the briars cutting him in the hard ground and rocky. Eyes wide, he watched Jamie Lee sit across his hips and come down expertly on his rigid staff. Buck me off, nigger boy, she ordered. See if you can buck me off. When he didn't thrust his hips violently enough or rapidly enough to suit her, Jamie Lee bent forward and dug her nails into the soft flesh on each of his shoulders. Holding him like that, she flailed her own hips savagely. Now he bit back cries of painful ecstasy. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before. She gasped frantically for breath, her mouth parted wide. She lifted her hips as high as she could without losing the head of the pulsating shaft driven up into her vagina, and then she plunged herself downward on it fiercely. She paused only long enough to rip open the bodice of her dress so that her voluptuous breast bobbled crazily before his glazed eyes as she worked herself up and down. White women, they sure as hell were strange. Crazy. Crazy as hell. Crazy, crazy, crazy. She was crazy. The craziest white woman of them all. And she was driving him crazy as she was. So crazy that he no longer gave a damn. Let the white men hang him. Let them shoot him full of buckshot. There were worse ways to die. He caught her full breast in both hands and used them to work her wildly, faster, faster, up and down upon him. Okay. Woo! I need to take a drink. I told you we'd get back into the erotica. Okay. Florine Pilzer stood for a long time on the shadowed front porch after Moab and the white girl had disappeared down the trail. Her eyes stung and filled with tears. It never occurred to Florine for one moment that Moab was simply riding as a guide and groom for that white girl. She knew what that white bitch wanted. She could look at her the way she could look at her, the way she hurried towards the pig tracks with Moab. Florine considered following them. At last she went back in. In the quiet house she felt caged as the walls crowded in on her. She prowled from room to room, returning often to the front door to scan the trail into the Blackoaks timberlands. It grew dark, and Florine knew that she should eat supper, cook something for Boz to eat when he came in. She had no heart for it. She was thankful Boz and the cotton wagons would not return from Mount Zion until late in the evening. Darkness settled swiftly, putting the house in blackness. She sighed, thinking how wonderful it would be if Moab could get away to her for a little while tonight. She laughed bitterly, an unlikely miracle if he came because, like her, he had no idea when Boz might return from Mount Zion. She and Moab had stayed alive so far by being too smart to take foolish chances. Boz would kill Moab if he ever found the boy in her bed or heard a whisper that the Negro had been in it. But Boz would kill her as well. White men believed in a white woman used by a black man was forever vile and better dead. Florine struck a sulfur match and lighted 2 candles, which she set near the front window as flickering aids to Boz whenever he did return. Then she went dully into the bedroom and in the darkness undressed and got ready for bed. She slipped her cotton gown over her head, wriggling her body to shake it over her high-standing breast and full hips. She remembered the way Moab had first caught her playing with herself. Boz had sent the boy at dawn to wash the cottage windows. How long ago, and yet it seemed only a few mornings past. Her life had begun that morning, though she hadn't realized it then. She smiled emptily, remembering. She would never forget the way Moab had stood, transfixed with shock, terror, and surprise, staring through her bedroom window at her lying sprawling, legs wide, naked on the bed, her fingers working furiously. She could not say to this moment which of them had been more frightened, she at being so surprised by a Negro, he at having violated her privacy, knowing she had the power to cost him his life. They had stared at each other in helpless terror. Sighing, Florine lay down on the bed. She settled upon her back and pulled her gown above her hips. She breathed raggedly, her stomach empty at what she was going to do. She closed her eyes, summoning Moab through images, heated memory, agonized need. She played with herself for a long time. She reached climaxes again and again, and each time she sagged exhausted to her pillow. But each time she lay breathless, tired and unmoving. The thought of Moab with that predatory white bitch burned into her mind again. She was still agonizedly awake when she heard Boz stomp noisily through the kitchen after midnight. Florine pretended to be deeply asleep, rolled far to her own side of the bed. It seemed to her that Boz took forever getting undressed. She heard his growling when he found she'd left no meal covered on the kitchen table for him. He stalked the kitchen, finding food, drinking milk, and cursing because milk delivered that morning was soured already. At last he came into the bedroom. He said, "Flo?" But when she did not respond, he undressed, grumbling. He dropped his sweated shirt and crusted trousers on the floor where he removed them. He flopped heavily on the mattress and removed his boots and stockings. He dropped each boot loudly. Florine knew he was trying to awaken her, but she continued to pretend the even, regular breathing of deep sleep. Still muttering in his guttural Dutch baritone, Boz stood up and stripped away his long underwear. He stood for some moments, yawning, stretching, and scratching at his privates. Then he poured cold water from the earthenware pitcher to its large matching bowl on the washstand. He grunted, shuddering, as he washed his face, neck, armpits, and quickly between his legs. He was a big man, 6 feet tall, brawny, with fearful muscles in his shoulders, biceps, and across his back. His muscular chest was keg-like. Long hours in the saddle had hardened the corded muscles in his thighs and upper legs. Drinking his own home-brewed beer had developed a thick pot belly on him, and his manhood drooped like a pendulous underhang lost in a crop of graying pubic hairs. Finally, he got noisily into bed. He said again, more insistently, "Flo, Flo, you awake?" She whimpered sleepily and pressed deeper into her pillow, hoping he would give up. But he laughed and pushed his hand under her arm. Catching her by a breast, he turned her over on her back. "You miss the old man, hon?" he said. "I'm dead for sleep, Boz." She resisted because sex with Boz Pilsner was totally without pleasure for her. It was so designed by Boz, who believed white women hated sex and merely endured it. From the first year of their marriage, Boz had adhered to a set pattern. He scrubbed roughly at her breast, ran his hands between her legs, then he mounted her, panting and driving. He was quickly aroused, quickly relieved, quickly sated. Then without a word, he always fell away from her and soon was snoring. Perhaps an hour or two later, Boz awoke, his mind befogged, sleep-numbed, certain he had heard or dreamt that Florine was lying beside him, crying in the darkness. "Flo? What?" Her voice sounded strangled. "You all right, hon? You crying, for God's sake?" "It's all right, Boz. It's nothing. Go back to sleep." Ooh. All right, we're on to chapter 12. Stiles went up to his bedroom about 9 o'clock that night. Moab was sprawled face down on his pallet in exhausted sleep. Stiles stared at the boy's naked body, the slowly healing wail across his back. He stood some moments unmoving, his thoughts heating sensually as he gazed upon the red golden body. In his imagination he recalled the nights Moab had lain in his bed with him, that beautiful body his to use as he willed. He couldn't help it. He treasured every moment he had spent with Moab. Stiles' viscera taunted. That overwhelming need flooded over him. He wanted to awaken Moab, to take the boy up in his arms and carry him to his bed. But he forced himself to consider the outside pressures, and also his need to be the master in these troublesome situations. Reluctantly, he turned away without waking the sleeping Moab. Instead, he rang for Thyestes and ordered a hot bath prepared in his dressing room. When he came out of the steaming tub, freshly shaved, his body powdered and sprinkled with cologne, he chose a fresh nightshirt, a silk dressing gown, and a white scarf, which he knotted at his throat and stuffed under the dark lapels of his robe. He studied his reflection for some moments in the full-length door mirror. He was pleased with the picture he made, and he smiled tautly at himself in the mirror. He was tall, slender, and he had the look of the true patrician. This was something from the inside, something that could not be faked. He turned, strode aside the room with one final glance at the naked black boy on the pallet, and let himself quietly out onto the corridor. I think I'm going to stop there, and we will definitely pick that up where we left off. This book seems to be heating up a little bit. I'm still with it. I'm enjoying it. We are archiving all these. So if you're joining us tonight and you want to hear what happened the first two nights, go to bedtimewithbruce.com and look under archive, and all the different sections are archived as far as the topic, the erotica, the regular literature, and the homoerotica. And then you can just watch part 1, part 2, part 3. Once again, it's been a pleasure having you here in the parlor with me. I look forward to seeing you next time. Come and visit us at www.bedtimewithbruce.com. And I will now say good night, and I will be back in a few minutes to complete the last hour, which is the homoerotic hour of the show. If you are leaving us now, thank you so much for stopping by. And if you will be staying with us, I will be back in a few minutes. Thank you so much.